Most of Emily Hart's life has been defined by a constant feeling of being a few steps ahead of everyone around her. From childhood, growing up in Flagstaff, Arizona, she harbored an unusual fascination with the stars and the unseen workings of things. While other children played jump rope or made beaded bracelets, Emily took apart flashlights, created small improvised circuits, and asked questions that amazed her. At 8 years old, she told her mother that the universe hid patterns. But even adults don't see. At 13, she finished a science project so complex that her teacher had to ask a physics professor from the local university for help evaluating. As an adult, at 32, already a PhD in astrobiology and atmospheric physics, Emily worked in a small laboratory associated with a university in Nevada. She was known for being reserved, methodical, and quite dedicated. But in the last 3 years, that dedication had become an obsession for some colleagues. They whispered in the hallways that Emily was going too far, exploring frontier areas, tinkering with improbable hypotheses about atmospheric signals that could indicate unknown intelligence. Some called her brilliant, others called her eccentric, and some, without any embarrassment, began to call her crazy. It all began with an unusual frequency spike recorded on a quiet January night. While analyzing routine data captured by an atmospheric observation antenna in a remote area near the Black Rock Desert, Emily noticed a harmonic pattern that shouldn't exist. It wasn't noise, nor satellite interference, nor reflection from commercial radio waves. There was repetition, there was rhythm, there was something that seemed intentional. Emily spent weeks analyzing the anomaly. She cross-referenced data, compared records from different antennas, filtered out interference, checked air traffic logs, and ruled out all possible conventional explanations. The pattern always returned at the same times, with varying intensity, but always following a kind of numerical signature. It was as if someone were sending a type of code, but not a common code, rather a code built on electromagnetic pulses that mimicked natural variations in the ionosphere, making it virtually invisible to any ordinary radar. When she presented her first reports to the university's scientific committee, she was met with skeptical looks. One of the directors raised an eyebrow, another sighed, and some members of the panel exchanged discreet glances as if they were dealing with a delicate case of mental exhaustion. Emily's report was robust, but the conclusions were too bold. The existence of an unknown emitter, hidden within the very natural oscillation of the Earth's atmosphere. Comments began to circulate. A senior lecturer murmured in the cafeteria, "She's seeing aliens in the wind." A researcher laughed during lunch. Emily got lost in her own graphs. Students whispered that she was spending more time in the lab than at home, but Emily didn't back down. On the contrary, she dove even deeper. She slept little, ate little, and her friends, the few who still kept in touch, tried to convince her to rest. She didn't listen to anyone. Science was her language, and the data was speaking clearly. On a particularly cold night, while working alone in the lab and reviewing atmospheric density graphs, she noticed something that took her breath away. The pattern had changed, and not just changed, it had responded. That's right, responded. Weeks earlier, Emily had sent an experimental pulse simulating artificial variations in the ionosphere, just to see if there would be any change in the behavior of the original signal. She hadn't expected anything to happen, it was just part of the process. But the return that night carried a modified echo, as if the sender had adjusted its message to reflect part of the pattern she herself had sent. Emily stood motionless before the screen, her heart racing. This was impossible. Unless someone out there, whoever it was, human or not, had detected and imitated her artificial variation. She spent hours analyzing, repeating calculations, comparing data, trying to find an earthly explanation, an error, a coincidence. She found nothing. What she had before her was a rudimentary but clear form of answer. The next day, she tried to present this new discovery to the university committee, but they were tired. Many no longer believed anything she said. Some had already submitted reports to the administrative board, suggesting that her research be suspended for scientific delusion and misuse of resources. One of the directors went straight to the point. "Dr. Hart, the university cannot continue to support experiments based on unsubstantiated hypotheses. It is damaging the department's credibility. Emily tried to argue. She showed graphs. She demonstrated the changes. She proved that the signal had changed precisely at the moment that corresponded to her attempts to intervene. But nobody wanted to listen. Hours later, the lab was sealed off for audit. Emily was temporarily suspended. Her badge was revoked. She left campus with red eyes, carrying a box with some belongings, while employees avoided eye contact with her. For weeks, she worked from home, using personal equipment, old computers, and makeshift software. She slept little. The feeling of being so close to something gigantic kept her awake. However, without access to the university's antennas, she was limited. She couldn't get new measurements. Former colleagues ignored her messages. Some blocked her number. But everything changed on a quiet April morning. Emily was making coffee when she heard a loud noise outside. When she looked out the window, she saw two black vehicles parked in front of her house. They weren't ordinary cars. They had tinted windows, discreet antennas, and a presence that suggested official representation. Before she could react, there was a firm knock on the door. "Dr. Emily Hart?" asked the taller man, dressed in a military uniform. She nodded, feeling a chill run down her spine. The man handed her a black folder on the living room table as soon as she allowed him in. He didn't smile. "We need to talk about the atmospheric signals you recorded this year." Emily stood motionless. Everyone said she was crazy, that she'd made it all up. And now the army was in her house? Another military officer, a woman with her hair tied back, placed 3 more folders on the table. "We've been monitoring the same frequency, and we believe you were the first civilian to detect it." Emily's head was spinning. The older soldier continued. "And most importantly, you achieved something that even our teams couldn't. You established communication." Emily swallowed hard. He opened the folders. Inside were classified documents, reports dating back more than 20 years, captures of signals very similar to hers, only weaker, frequencies hidden within natural atmospheric variables, comparative analysis, diagrams, maps showing reception points scattered across deserts, mountain ranges, and isolated regions of Alaska. Everything there proved that Emily had been right all along. As Emily flipped through the document, she felt a devastating mix of relief and indignation. She could have been heard from the beginning. She could have advanced months of research. She could have avoided the ostracism, the shame, the isolation. The soldier then explained something even more surprising. "There's a reason why nobody at the university took you seriously. It wasn't just disbelief. Some of those people were instructed not to divulge anything if they found similar patterns. But you went too far, too fast, and you attracted attention." Emily took a few seconds to process it. Not only had they ignored her, they had withheld information. "Why did you come to me?" she finally asked. The soldier replied, "Because you achieved something that no one has achieved in decades. And because the standard changed again this morning." She opened one last folder and pushed it toward Emily. Inside were charts almost identical to hers, but with one difference. At the base of one of the pulses was a new rhythm, something that resembled a primary structure of mathematical language. "Do you recognize this?" the soldier asked. Emily recognized it. It was the same type of variation she had sent months before, but now it was more complex, as if whoever was on the other end was learning. "What do you want?" she asked. The older soldier took a deep breath. "We need you to go back to your studies, but not at the university. You would work with a special division. We need someone who understands this pattern as well as you, someone who has already established a principle of communication. If this sender is really trying to understand us, you may be the key to decoding it." Emily stared at the documents as one might look at a map of an unknown world. Her heart was racing, but for the first time in months, it was beating with hope. They continued, "And there's more. Before coming here, we had a strategic risk meeting. It was determined that if this communication moves forward, we cannot allow civilians to remain uninformed while the government keeps everything hidden. Your research can be used to establish contact protocols, but you need to cooperate." Emily sat down slowly, gripping the edge of the table as if the weight of the moment might topple her. Years of humiliation, isolation, and discredit finally made sense. Not only was she right, she was standing before something that could change humanity's understanding of the planet itself. "When do we start?" she asked. The soldiers exchanged glances, and the older one replied, "Now." 2 hours later, Emily was inside one of the black vehicles, being driven to a remote facility. During the ride, she mentally reviewed each graph, each pattern, each variation. The outside world rushed past the window, but her mind was elsewhere in the invisible space between the known and the impossible. Upon arriving at the operations center, she realized that her research had been completely replicated on giant screens. Algorithms, supercomputers, and dedicated antennas. Entire teams were monitoring the same signals she had discovered alone in a forgotten laboratory. From that day on, Emily Hart ceased to be the mad scientist. She became the center of a silent operation conducted by some of the country's leading experts. And as time passed, something extraordinary happened. Communication evolved. The sender responded in increasingly structured ways, almost as if trying to imitate human patterns. Emily realized that this wasn't just a scientific discovery. It was the beginning of a new era. An era she was the first to see, even when everyone called her crazy. And now, faced with advanced systems, illuminated screens, and entire teams awaiting her instructions, she finally knew. The message she had detected was not just an atmospheric error, it was an invitation. And Emily Hart was ready to respond. In the following days, Emily realized that everything she had experienced up to that point was merely a rehearsal for what was now unfolding before her. The routine in the secret facility had no windows, no visible clocks, no clear sign of day. She only knew that time was passing because her body began to complain, and from time to time, someone would place a tray of food next to the keyboard without saying anything. In the main room, dozens of monitors displayed dynamic graphs of the ionosphere, particle flows, frequency variations, and lines of code scrolling from top to bottom. A huge central panel showed a spectrum of colors that moved continuously, as if the sky had been transformed into a living organism. In the right corner, a small strip showed only a mutating numerical sequence, the signature of the unknown emitter. Emily stood there, hands clasped, observing as one contemplates something sacred and dangerous at the same time. Few called her by her first name. Most referred to her as Dr. Hart or simply the civilian specialist. But as the days went by, the looks began to change. The initial distrust gave way to a kind of silent respect. They knew they were there because of her. One early morning, when she only realized it was the middle of the night because the coffee tasted like reheated coffee, a young analyst approached her with a tense expression. "Dr. Hart, the pattern repeats itself again, but this time, it's not the same." He showed her a sequence. Alongside the sender's basic signature, a new block of pulses had now appeared, shorter, more frequent, organized in a way that resembled something she had been trying to build, a kind of numerical alphabet. Emily sat down, leaning over the keyboard. She began to draw the sequence on a sheet of paper, connecting points, marking pauses, noting intervals. Instinctively, she tried to translate it into simple mathematical structure, primes, powers, proportions. Suddenly, she realized that within that seemingly chaotic sequence, there was an order that evoked something profoundly human. Repetition, reinforcement, correction. "They're trying to imitate the way we teach," he murmured. The analyst frowned. "Like this? When we teach math to children, we repeat many similar examples, adjusting, correcting, and reinforcing them. That's what this sender is doing. He's trying to show us that he understands we're trying to establish a communication pattern. He's giving back variations, as if saying, I understand. Look, I can do that too." She remained silent, feeling a shiver that had nothing to do with temperature. It wasn't just a sign from nowhere. It was an entity, whatever it was, demonstrating a capacity for learning. The commander in charge of the operation, Colonel Walker, was summoned. He arrived within minutes with his usual serious expression and listened to Emily's explanation without interrupting. At the end, he spent a few seconds looking at the screen, then at her notes. In other words, he said, "This is progressing. It's evolving," Emily corrected calmly. "It's not just a reflex. It's an adaptive response." Walker leaned back in his chair. "We need to know if it's hostile." Those words cut through the air. Whenever someone spoke of hostility, the atmosphere in the room changed. It Didn't matter if the speaker was extraterrestrial, human, a secret artificial intelligence, or something completely new. The military question was always the same. Does it represent a threat? Emily took a deep breath. There's still no sign of aggression, he replied. What we have so far are test patterns, echoes, variation. If it were hostile, it could try to overload the ionosphere, interfere with communication signal, cause chaos. So far, there's nothing like that. It seems more curious. One of the intelligence officers approached, crossing his arms. Curious people can quickly become dangerous, he commented. Emily bit her lip, but didn't back down. Ignoring this is far more dangerous than trying to understand it. In the following days, the team created a protocol for experimental messages through specific antennas. At controlled times, they would send carefully calculated variations of signals, always based on universal mathematical principles, Fibonacci sequences, prime numbers, constant proportions, things that any intelligence operating with numerical logic could recognize. Emily led the design of the messages. She wrote sequences that, translated into pulses, established small conversations without human language. It was like trying to talk to someone who doesn't know words, using only patterns of light and shadow. With each new message sent, everyone stopped for a few minutes, observing the response on the central screen. Sometimes, nothing happened. Sometimes, the sender reacted with an almost identical echo. Other times, subtle mutations appeared, small inversions, extra repetitions. Over time, Emily came to recognize a kind of personality in that behavior. I didn't know if it was an entity, a set of entities, a system, a technology, but I felt, almost instinctively, that there was intention. One night, while analyzing a recent sequence, Emily realized that the transmitter had repeated the exact same series of pulses 3 times in a row, with absolutely identical intervals. It wasn't a variation, it wasn't a test, it was persistence. She grabbed a notepad and began marking the groups of pulses, trying to interpret them as individual units, as if they were syllables of an unknown language. Gradually, she noticed that some combinations reappeared in similar contexts, always associated with certain types of messages sent by them. It was as if, when sending a certain mathematical sequence, the sender returned a fixed symbol, something that could represent yes, I understand, or I acknowledge. Sleep had completely eluded her. She began to assemble a primary vocabulary, a set of equivalences between certain human sequences and the sender's responses. He called it an echo map. When he presented this map to the team, many fell silent. It wasn't just a chart, it was the outline of a dictionary. Are you telling me that we already have a form of words? Asked Colonel Walker. It's still rudimentary, Emily explained, but yes, we have blocks that can function as questions, confirmations, negations. If we continue, at some point, we'll be able to convey something more complex than numbers. A heavy silence filled the room. If it were ever possible to convey something more complex than numbers, it would mean moving from simple technical contact to communicating concepts, ideas, warnings, perhaps even emotions. Days later, another twist occurred, not at the traffic light, but within the walls of that facility. When Emily arrived at work, she noticed the atmosphere was different. There were more armed people in the hallways, whispered conversation, and locked doors that were normally only slightly ajar. In the main room, some monitors had been turned off. Others displayed large restricted access signs. As Emily approached her workstation, a brief message awaited her on the screen. Mandatory meeting. Briefing room 3. She went there and found Colonel Walker, 2 officers she didn't yet know, and a woman in a dark suit with no visible identification. The atmosphere was stiff. Everyone seemed to carry a concern that had not yet been shared with her. The woman in the suit spoke first in a firm voice. Dr. Hart, based on the last 48 hours, there has been a decision at higher levels. Some of the data we were receiving was correlated with geospatial anomalies detected by other systems, which are not under the exclusive jurisdiction of this unit. Emily frowned. Geospatial anomalies? Of what exactly? Subtle changes in the orbits of communication satellites, the woman replied. Microscopic but real. And the problem is that these changes occurred in time windows very close to the more structured responses from the sender. Emily felt a tightness in her chest. Are you saying that the transmitter is interacting with our satellite? The woman neither confirmed nor denied it, simply maintaining a neutral tone. "We're saying there's a temporal correlation, and that's what made our superiors raise the risk level. If someone or something is able to manipulate the ionosphere in this way, perhaps they're also able to exert influence over objects in orbit. That changes the game." The room fell silent for a few moments. Emily rested her hands on the table. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Colonel Walker cleared his throat, as if choosing his words carefully. "From today onwards, all experimental messages will be reviewed and approved by Strategic Command. Before being sent, you will continue to lead the interpretations, but you will no longer be able to decide the content of the transmitted sequences on your own." Emily felt it as a silent blow. Not that she wanted absolute control, but she knew that the spontaneity of attempts was part of the evolution of communication. Turning every message into a bureaucratic process could halt progress. "They're going to turn this into a weapon," she thought without saying it aloud. Still, she nodded. "I understand." In the days that followed, conversations with the sender became slower, more stalled. Any new sequence Emily developed needed to go through risk analysis, review, approval, formal registration. Many were vetoed before leaving the room. Too complex, potentially interpretable as a threat, could be interpreted as the delivery of strategic information. She began to realize that the structure of human power was as complicated as, or even more complicated than, any code coming from the sky. Even so, the sender continued responding, patiently, almost resiliently, as if it didn't care about the reduced volume, only about the continuity. The returned sequences maintained the same mathematical calmness, the same pattern of intelligent echo. Emily, at a distance, felt as if she were talking to someone who wasn't in a hurry, but who was observing everything with absolute attention. One early morning, however, something unprecedented happened. The main antenna picked up a response wave more intense than any other before. Monitors began displaying spikes, saturation alarms were triggered, and technicians rushed to adjust levels. The emitter, for some reason, had amplified the strength of its presence in the ionosphere. Emily was summoned urgently. When she entered the room, she saw the central panel filled with denser colors, the frequency curves overlapping, forming a design that looked more like a storm contained within lines. But there was order in that storm. She approached, her eyes fixed on the sequence. Her heart raced. "Stop downplaying the gain. Please let us read the full story," he pleaded. Someone protested that it could overload the system. Colonel Walker hesitated, but gestured with his hand, allowing them to proceed with her request. Then the sequence appeared, clean, full of detail. It was long, repetitive, with blocks of pulses arranged in a pattern that looked like a gigantic mosaic. Emily felt her hands tremble. She recognized parts of it, fragments of sequences she had sent many weeks before. Other parts were variations of previous responses, rearranged. It was as if the sender had taken everything they had already exchanged and stitched it together into a new form. "He's going over everything," he murmured, as if he's showing that he remembers everything, that he keeps track of everything. One of the analysts approached, or as if he were trying to bring everything together into some kind of larger message. That idea left Emily speechless. And as she analyzed it, she began to notice a hierarchical structure within the mosaic of risks, blocks of blocks, repetitions on different scales, small variations on the edges, as if there were layers of meaning hidden there. She took the sequence to a smaller room, connected the system to analysis software she had developed years before, and performed decompositions, transformations, and extractions at multiple scales. Hours passed without her noticing. At one point, Colonel Walker entered the room and found her surrounded by papers and charts. "Anything?" he asked. Emily looked up, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of exhaustion and enthusiasm. "It's not just an answer, it's an invitation." An invitation for what? She pulled out one of the sheets and placed it before him. On it was a pie chart, divided into irregular slices, each associated with a section of the sequence. Below, numbers represented exact proportions, repeated at different scales. "They are trying to show us a model, a map of how they organize their own information, as if they were saying, 'This is how we think.'" Can you understand? Walker stared at the sheet of paper for a few seconds, then sighed. And can you do it? Emily gave a small, tired smile. Not yet. But I know how to recognize when someone is opening the door to their own house. While the technical side of the team grappled with the mathematical implications of that map, another part of the government began to worry about something far more human. What would happen if the world knew? There, in that unnamed facility, lay proof that the planet was not alone, or that, at the very least, there was an unidentified intelligence operating on scales that defied common understanding. No democracy, no government, no institution was prepared to handle the mixture of fear, hope, chaos, and faith that this could unleash. In a more restricted meeting, some argued that everything should be kept secret indefinitely. Others argued that hiding something so big was impossible in the long term. And there was a third, rarer position, held by few: the idea that involving outsiders, independent civilian scientists, universities, even international bodies could accelerate understanding and reduce the risk of decisions being made by a small group on behalf of all humanity. Emily was called upon to give her opinion. She wasn't used to being included in strategic-level decisions. The last time she'd been to an important meeting, it had been to be discredited at the university. Now, entering a room filled with uniforms, suits, and scrutinizing glances, she felt that weight on her chest again, but this weight came with something new: the certainty that her voice now carried real weight. A high-ranking general asked directly, "Dr. Hart, you are the first civilian scientist to build this bridge. In your opinion, what is the greater risk, telling the world or not telling?" Emily took a deep breath. She knew that any poorly worded phrase could be used as an argument by one side or the other for years. "The biggest risk," she said slowly, "is letting fear decide on its own. If we keep this 100% secret, we will inevitably start making decisions based on the assumption of threat. Because that's the default way of thinking in closed environments. Secrecy breeds paranoia, and paranoia breeds error. On the other hand, if we reveal everything at once, without context, without preparation, we could cause panic. In my opinion, the most responsible approach is gradual. Publicly acknowledge that there are atmospheric anomalies under study. Discreetly expand the scientific groups involved. Create collaborative networks. We don't need to use words like contact or intelligence at the beginning, but we need to let the world get close to the edge of what's happening. Otherwise, we'll be a handful of people deciding alone about something that concerns everyone." There was a thick silence. Some agreed with an almost imperceptible nod. Others frowned, clearly opposed to the idea of sharing any part of such a delicate secret. The woman in the dark suit, whom Emily now knew was connected to a national security agent, leaned back in her chair. "That's an honest answer, Dr. Hart, but it's not simple to translate into politics. There are economic, military, religious, and geopolitical interests at play. Any misstep could destabilize entire regions." Emily held her gaze. "Any misstep in here can also be harmful." In the following days, reports, simulations, and communication plans were drawn up and destroyed several times, while the higher-ups debated what to do with the sender continued to send his sequences, patient, consistent, as if completely ignoring the human disputes about secrecy and disclosure. On an afternoon when the sky outside, invisible from the installation, but visible on weather satellites, was clear, a new, unexpected sequence emerged. It was shorter than the previous mosaic, but it had something that no other had shown before: a rhythmic repetition reminiscent of the beat of a drum. It wasn't exactly a heartbeat, but Emily, looking at the graph, immediately thought so. The transmitter had used a variation in intensity and interval to create something extremely similar to an organic pulse. Intensity, pause, stronger intensity, longer pause, repetition. She stood there, staring at the graph without blinking. "What is this?" asked one of the technicians. "It's a biological response test," Emily whispered, more to herself than to the others. "They're trying to replicate a structure we know as life." In the preceding days, they had sent simple data about the relationship between time and energy, patterns that might resemble natural cycles. If the sender was now constructing something that mimicked a heartbeat, it meant that Somehow, they had extracted from those equations a notion of living rhythm. Emily couldn't help the shiver that ran down her spine. It was as if, through the ionosphere, something unknown had just said, "I understand that you are more than just numbers." From that moment on, she began to feel something she had never felt in her career: emotional responsibility. It was no longer just science. On the other side, there was a presence that seemed to try to understand them on progressively deeper levels. Each new sequence they sent now seemed laden with ethical implications. What were they teaching? What were they revealing about human nature, even without using words? One night, exhausted, Emily left the main room and went to a small inner terrace that few people used. There was no view of the outside, only a narrow skylight through which a rectangle of sky could be seen at certain times. By chance, at that hour, the skylight showed a dark patch sprinkled with stars. She rested her hands on the windowsill and stared upwards in silence. She thought of all the times she had been ridiculed in the university hallways, the malicious comments, the pitying glances. She thought of how it all hurt, not only because of wounded pride, but because it carried a sense of injustice. She knew there was something there, and no one wanted to look. Now, facing that rectangle of sky, she felt something different. It wasn't revenge. It was a strange kind of reconciliation. "You were there the whole time, weren't you?" he murmured, as if speaking to the heavens themselves. "And yet, you let us stumble over our own walls." No one heard her question, but hours later, when she returned to the control room, she found a new sequence on the central screen. With a slight peculiarity, a part of the signal had been subtly shifted in a rhythm that again resembled a beat, but now with a final variation, something like a prolonged note. She had no way of knowing if it had any connection to what she had felt on that rooftop, but as she analyzed the new sequence, she realized that, somehow, she could no longer treat it as a purely cold experiment. Somewhere, in some layer of reality, someone or something was listening. And despite all the uniforms, all the military documents, all the top-secret stamps on the folders stacked on the tables, Emily Hart knew deep down that the most extraordinary thing about it all wasn't the technological power, nor the potential threat, nor the strategic advantage. What truly changed everything was the simple fact that, for the first time in history, the silence of the universe had answered. And it had answered not with shouting, not with war, not with destruction, but with patient, repeated, almost gentle pattern. As if, before saying anything, he first wanted to learn to listen.